Oops, all right. Let me get a little hydration in before I get started. When you teach history, you kind of want to visit a lot of the places that you are talking about to your students. And thanks to YouTube and Scott's Cheap Flights, I have had the good fortune over the past few years to travel to quite a few destinations in Europe. And most recently, I've come to Israel. And I want to make just a brief primer on tipping in Europe and Israel versus the United States, because I don't want you to be in a situation that I was in last night where I was thinking, wait, am I supposed to tip here, or how much? Is this more like the United States or like Europe? So in the United States, what Americans are used to is that 15% is a standard tip and 20% is a generous tip if you've received really good service. Now, of course, you go to Europe where the wait staff is actually paid a proper living wage. And so a tip is seen for, well, what it is. It is seen as a bonus, something that is given on top of something, whereas in the United States, it's expected to tip because wait staff, they're paid just over $2 an hour, and most of that gets eaten up once tips are declared. In the United States, it's frowned upon not to leave a tip. It's seen as indecent. This is what we call stiffing the server, and this is only reserved for the worst type of service, because when you don't leave a tip, you're actually costing the server money because they have to tip out to the bartender and the bus staff and all of that. And so when it comes down to it, in the United States, you're expected to tip. In Europe, if you leave a euro or two, then it's really seen as, okay, well, you left a tip. Maybe if you're at a fine dining restaurant, something like 10 to 15%. But really, a 10% tip in Europe, no matter where you are, isn't going to get you looked at like somebody who's cheap. In fact, you're going to be seen as decent. And 15% would be, wow, that's generous. Whereas that's not the case in the United States. Well, when I got to Israel, I found myself asking after I sat down for a meal, how am I supposed to tip here? And so later on, I looked on the internet and I realized that, okay, in Israel, it is actually more like the United States in the sense that the wait staff is paid very poorly and they are largely living on tips. So when you're in Israel, you want to tip at restaurants more like you would tip in the United States, because these people who work in the restaurant are counting on your tip for their sustenance. So in that sense, it's much more like the United States than it is in Europe. Now, another thing I found out was that in Israel, you are not expected to tip the cab driver. If you pay what the cab driver quoted you, you are seen as completely decent. You're not a terrible human being or anything like that. It is very similar in Europe. In the United States, a lot of times that is seen as generous and decent to tip the cab driver. But in Israel, you don't have to tip the cab driver, but you should leave a generous tip of 15 to 20% at the restaurants, just like you are in the United States. Let me know in the comments what you think about this type of video. Would you like to see me do more travel videos? Because after all, that is educational. And remember, everyone, stay hydrated, and it is always a pleasure.